Remind me which site that is.
It's in Pittsburgh. It has 2 grounds next to a railroad.
Maxi.
Hi, Marrikka. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. How are you doing in your groups?
We're great. We're doing well. Feels productive.
Hey, I'm really excited to see what everyone chose and how they're approaching it.
And we should have Michael joining soon.
Guys, I know we're live streaming, but if you, the students in the room, wouldn't mind keeping your cameras on. It's very good for the person who's trying to give the talk to be able to see faces.
Is that on your school network?
Adam, mute yourself.
did him a favor and muted him. Hey, Russell.
Hey, Maxie.
Hey. Just checking my email. See. Genevieve said Michael join soon.
Mamá huevo.
Hi, Maxie.
Hi, Christy. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Good. We're good. We're ready. We're waiting for Michael. He should join
Great.
in a second. Yeah, I'm checking all the squares here. Okay, he's getting a password. This Zoom room doesn't have a password request. One second, guys.
I'm just copying the invite link directly from this.
Yeah.
If that helps.
Yeah, it does not have a password.
Maxie,
Hi.
I figured it out.
Oh, great. Okay, sorry, I'm on the different room now. Okay. Hi, Michael. I don't know in which square you are.
I see
You
you.
there?
I see him.
Okay. Hi. Well, welcome. It's a pleasure to have you join our undergraduate thesis class. We're super excited. Just to reintroduce a little bit the series, this is the third installment of the one-to-one conversation series. We invited three well-known, well-regarded architects, and yes, you're the third one. We interview Jesse Reiser and Anna Kumamoto in the first week, Neil Denari last week, and now Marrikka will have a conversation with you. I don't want to spend too much time on Michael's CV because I think the students know it well. So I just wanna jump in the conversation. Like it's been the case with the previous architects. They provided a PowerPoint, which is just for reference. It's gonna look in the background as the conversation flow. And I'm going to set up that PowerPoint right now. Let me see that. Can you guys see my screen right now? Good. All right, great, fantastic. So I'm gonna pass the baton here to Marrikka and Michael. You guys take it away.
Thanks, Maxie.
So hi, Michael. Hi, guys. Thank you so much for talking to us today. I'm really looking forward to you sharing your work. And it's funny because, you know, here in Los Angeles, at least the initial encounter with Michael's formidable reputation comes in the form of housing. But actually, there's a larger approach and a whole range of typologies that the firm has taken on since Michael founded it in 1995. So I just want the students to be aware that we're looking at a small slice of the overall work. It is, I think, particularly germane, though, based on the amount of housing as a program typology that is available and being engaged by our students this semester, and also the ever more obvious urgency with which housing needs to be addressed in the city of Los Angeles in particular, as well as in many other places around the country and indeed around the world. So just like a few hot seconds on Michael's CV, so you guys kind of know where this guy is coming from. He actually started out in architecture and art at the design school, Rhode Island School of Design, RISD on the East Coast. Graduated.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Rian, mute yourself. Anyhow, graduated there with the Henry Adams AIA gold medal under his belt, proceeded on to the Harvard GSD, where he graduated with an MArch in distinction. He is now a fellow of the AIA, the American Institute of Architects. He has received many, many AIA awards, including most recently a 2020 Best of the Millennium Award. I think that's pretty cool to win a Best of the Millennium Award from the Los Angeles chapter of the AIA Award. His work is part of the permanent collections of MoCA LA, MoMA New York, and the CCA up in Montreal. He's participated in the Venice Biennale a number of times, most recently in 2020. Let's see, he's a recipient of the American Academy of Arts and Letters Architecture Award. He's elected to the National Academy of Design in 2020. And actually recently I caught a really wonderful conversation, Michael, that you did with some of your colleagues at the GSD. Actually, it was a conversation that was hosted by the Joint Center for Housing, and you were specifically being asked to respond to the prompt, what exactly can architecture do about homelessness? And this is an ethical issue that has long been at the heart of Michael Maltzan's practice and Michael Maltzan architecture. Some really innovative work in terms of not just getting it done, but also the scale at which it operates. So with all that being said, we decided to focus today on two different housing projects. Each one of them very innovative, and one of them many of you SCI-Arc students know intimately because it is the building in which you live. And that, of course, would be One Santa Fe. But before One Santa Fe, Michael pioneered an architectural typology that had not existed in Los Angeles before then, known typically as permanent supportive housing. And he worked with some real thought leaders in the city, Skid Row Housing Trust, to bring about what seemed at the time to be an impossibility. Housing for Los Angeles's homeless, many of them facing the other conditions that often go along with that. The unhoused population faces issues related to veterans, PTSD, and other psychological traumas, as well as rates of HIV/AIDS not seen in the general population, as well as complicated issues surrounding addiction and the kinds of psychological damage that go hand in hand with not having a place to call one's own over time. And actually, one of the critiques that was leveled against Michael's work with projects such as the ones we're going to look at today is how could you possibly design something so nice for these people, for this population? Strange question to ask, but it goes to the heart of something that concerns all of us in Thesis, which is, what is it that architecture does? What is the work of architecture? How does it operate in the world? And can it operate both as something that does the work of putting roofs over people's head, and as something that does the work of communicating, of something that represents, of something that embodies, of even something that maybe bodies forth. So all that to say, can't wait for this. Michael, thank you so much for being here. And would you like to give us a little bit of background about how you got involved in housing to begin with in the city of Los Angeles, and maybe start from there?
Sure. And thank you for a very nice introduction. I have been working, Marrikka, as you mentioned, on a wide range of projects and typologies, programs since the starting of my practice. That was in 1995. And while the work has been varied and also varied geographically, I, from a very early point in my career, was interested in what role architecture could have in the city, especially in very complex challenges and issues around social concerns, community concerns. And a lot of that grew out of being here in the mid-1990s when the Rodney King uprisings, the riots, took place. It was a moment when the city, its true personality and many of its real challenges, many of its real issues became much clearer to everybody. And a lot of the romance of Los Angeles started to drop away because it was clear that there were incredible inequalities. There was lack of access. The city was really a city of many, many different siloized communities, not really connected. LA had this myth of being a multicultural city for many years, but it was clear at that moment that in fact Los Angeles was a city of many cultures, but not really an integrated multicultural city. That led me to begin to work with a group in Skid Row called Inner City Arts, which is a nonprofit arts organization. It's very close to SCI-Arc. It's on 7th Street and Kohler. And that was, for me, the first opportunity to try to make architecture perform, for it to work, for it to have an effect in a part of the city that most people would not have imagined architects and architecture to really be present or be working in. Inner City Arts was and continues to be quite successful as not only being a place for kids to be engaged in the arts, but it really became a kind of community center for a community that does in fact live in and around Skid Row. And the reason that's actually important to the story of housing is that a few blocks down the street, Skid Row Housing Trust, our client for much of this housing, has their main offices and also had renovated a building that became transitional shorter-term apartment spaces for homeless individuals. Skid Row at the time was trying to change their model. They knew that the transitional shelter-based model wasn't really working, where people were coming in and out of the buildings for a few weeks or a month. It wasn't really having any kind of long-term lasting positive effect on homelessness. And they started to look at the ideas that were emerging in responses to homelessness around that time, around permanent supportive housing, which is exactly what that term says it is. It's permanent housing for individuals with supportive services for those individuals in the building itself. But they had no model for that. And they knew Inner City Arts. They thought it had created a surprising and somewhat unprecedented effect in a part of the city in Skid Row. And they thought maybe maybe I could help do the same thing with this new type of housing program. They contacted me and asked if I would be interested in doing the project, this first project, Rainbow Apartments, which is on San Pedro. And I, just as, and the last thing I'll say to this question, I grew up in architecture at a moment in school when the history of architecture and modernism were significant parts of my education. And if you look at that history of modernism, especially the early modernists, the European modernists, were very involved in housing and developing new prototypes, new typologies for housing. It was a place where architecture was actively engaging the changes in culture and society and trying to invent a new form. And I came out of school expecting that I would do housing because that's what I thought architects did. And it wasn't until I started a practice that I realized that there was some housing being built, but they weren't hiring architects that looked like me to do that housing. And I started to become very discouraged because I thought I wasn't going to get a chance to do that kind of housing. And it took a group like the Housing Trust, Skid Row Housing Trust, who had a goal of trying to employ architecture for innovation, that I realized there was, in fact, a pathway to be involved in housing. And that was really the beginning of it. That was the beginning of what has now been 4 built projects with them and a 5th one in development.
So I'm wondering, there was a very a moving, at least I found it so, because it felt very authentic in a way that not many architects are generous enough with their audiences to put on the table. There was a very moving part of an interview with you, or it may have even been the talk that you recently gave at the Joint Center for Housing. Oh, yeah, I think it was. Where you talk about your first project, which is the Rainbow Apartments, and about how when you finished that project, you felt like you had failed. Actually, would you be willing to talk about some of the struggle and some of the work that went into that project?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Rainbow was the very first project that we did with the Housing Trust, and it was their first permanent supportive housing project as well. We developed the design of the project, and there were parts of the project that I thought were extremely important to the overall architecture of the building, really especially the aesthetics of the building. There were I guess almost decorative screens on the inside of the courtyard that started to enliven that courtyard. There was much more transparency in the building, much more glass in the building, connecting spaces within the building, but also from the outside to the inside. There were a lot more details, frankly, in the project as it was designed, that when we started into construction, started to be lost. And the reason that happened was when we were building Rainbow Apartments, it was in the mid-2000s. And probably no one in the class remembers that. But it was a time in the economy when the economy was heavily overheated, leading up to eventually the recession in 2008, beginning in 2008. But what was happening was that construction and construction materials, contractors themselves, everything, all the costs were just exploding. And the way that Rainbow Apartments, the way that the construction contract had been structured, the contractor had the ability to raise their prices if the materials that they were buying at that moment were at a higher price than they had estimated. The problem was that was happening to everything in the project. The project had a fixed budget, and it meant that we had to keep pulling things out of the building that I thought were extremely important parts of the architecture, and also extremely important parts to what I thought would ultimately be the livability, contributing to the livability and the quality of life for the people who would eventually become residents at Rainbow Apartments. When we were done, it was, I looked around at the building and there was very little left of what I had imagined the building was, what the architecture of the building was. And it was an exhausting and quite disappointing process. And I got to the end and I thought, beyond disappointment for the architect, I was really genuinely um, anxious and almost a little depressed about this idea that people would be living in a building and that it would be it wouldn't be a great experience, that it would be a really diminished experience, and that we had somehow failed not only architecture, but we had failed the residents, the community that was meant to live there. It took months after people had moved in. In all of these buildings, we continue to go back and see how the buildings are performing with the residents. And they get a lot of feedback as well from the residents. The Housing Trust gets a lot of feedback. And surprisingly to me, the community was thriving and the tenants, the residents were thriving. And I started to realize in talking with people there, seeing how they were using the building, that while we had lost much of what you might typically say is the architecture, the more fundamental aspects of the architecture, the planning, the relationships between spaces, the way that the community was organized and could choreograph themselves in the building, really the fundamental things that we do as architects that we learn early on in our first years in studio and bring to a project, how you organize a project, that those things were actually, they were really, they were working. And they were the things that were having the effect on the residents and allowing them to have significant individual lives, to have privacy, but to also have semi-public and public lives, and to create and form community in the building. And that there was a diversity of opportunity for how they could construct their life that didn't diminish or minimize their individuality, but allowed that individuality to grow. And it was an important moment because I realized that, in fact, architecture had made it through that process. But it was in the fundamental aspects of what an architect does that we so often forget, we take for granted. And going forward, that became a hugely important lesson in how we subsequently and continue to think about the buildings and how we organize the design process to set up a set of expectations that we can really deliver on in the end.
Thank you for that. That was so so beautifully put. And I'm so curious, as I imagine some of the students listening are, what some of those essential moves were in that project. I imagine that they would include things that you had already put on the table or made part of your toolkit in the Inner City Arts project, where you're talking about a kind of arrangement of individual elements that form almost a microcosm or a mini urbanism. How did that play out in the kind of stripped down version of the Rainbow?
Maybe
project?
one of the most important things that we did was to reorganize the typical apartment massing that you would have seen up before Rainbow in most of the housing that, well, all of the housing that the Housing Trust had done, but frankly, in most even market rate housing in and around the city. And that is that most housing is built in a very similar way to a kind of hotel. There's a corridor, double loaded corridor down the middle, and there are apartments or rooms in the case of a hotel, but apartments on either side. And it's very efficient. It's the least expensive way to organize a floor because the corridor is actually serving apartments on both sides. So We deal a lot with things like net to gross, which I'm not going to get into necessarily unless somebody wants to, but we're trying to maximize the apartment spaces and minimize all of the other collateral spaces like corridors. But at Rainbow, as opposed to the double loaded corridor, we cracked the building open so that and organized the building as a courtyard, a U-shaped courtyard, with the corridor running around the inside, and then actually it pops out on the north side, on the other side. But it basically is a single loaded corridor around the space. And the reason that was so important and actually quite radical for the trust was that one of the things we found was in understanding the program for this type of housing is that the majority of people who live in these buildings have been categorized as chronically homeless. And chronically homeless has meant different things over the years, but generally it means that you've been on the streets living homelessly for 6 or more years, which I would have expected 6 months was chronically homeless, but it gives you a sense of the scale of what many of these individuals have endured. The problem is that those people, the homeless individuals who've been on the street are super exposed all of the time. And inevitably what happens is they start to create these kind of psychological fortresses around themselves and become very isolated from society as a way of protecting themselves often. With Rainbow Apartments, I was worried that people would come into the building in a typical double loaded corridor. People would come into the building, go up the elevator, walk down this anonymous corridor, disappear into their room, and they'd never see anybody. They'd never interact again. But by organizing the building as an open single loaded corridor around this semi-public but safe space, this internal community courtyard, every time you came in or went to or came out of your apartment, you were at least in this slightly more semi-public realm. You weren't anonymous, you were visible. And that had the effect of slowly allowing people to feel more comfortable being in a more open social setting, and gave the opportunity for community and relationships to start to be formed in the building, for relationships to start to form in the building. And that didn't mean that the corridors had to have a highly crafted or articulated aesthetic screen around it. They didn't have to be a great color. The materials didn't have to be fancy materials. It was just that the corridors were organized that way around this courtyard in a way that people hadn't done up until that time. And it had an enormous effect. We did things like took very prosaic spaces like the laundry room, which would often be pushed off into a corner that nobody really saw, and placed it in really the most prominent spot in the courtyard. When you come up the big stairs off of the street into the courtyard, the thing that's directly in front of you is the laundry room. And the reason for that is that not that the laundry room was great looking, but that it was the place that everybody in the building uses. It was the great social connector. And by placing that in a more visible and prominent location, that simple, very prosaic chore of doing your laundry put you in a place where you could connect to the people around you. You got to say hello, or someone just waved to you. And those simple things have huge effects on the residents in these buildings. So those are 2 examples.
I think that's super helpful. And I'm struck as you talk about it by the degree to which subsequent projects shunted all of the architectural effort, or a great deal of the architectural effort, into just that, the distribution of spaces, the arrangement of spaces, an emphasis on circulation, an emphasis on the kind of placement of different levels and different ways to interact, over and above a lot of other things that architects might normally decide to put their budget toward. Like there's a simplicity, almost like an absence in the articulation of surfaces in a number of these projects. It's not that they're unarticulated, they are articulated. And perhaps you might even speak a little bit to the role that color plays in some of these projects, and the way that developed a little bit out of the Rainbow Project, from what I understand. But the focus is on this arrangement.
How's it going?
Right. Well, that's
Okay. Yeah.
hang on one
I can
second.
say that I took the girls to get their shots too.
Genevieve.
Thank you. All right, so I'm working on the
I just muted her. Sorry.
Okay, great, thank you.
Okay, go for it.
It's absolutely true that the arrangement, it's about what materials you actually have to work with as an architect. And the most, you have all of the building materials. You have windows, you have obviously doors, walls, all of those things. You can try to make an architecture out of that, and that's a hugely important thing. But even before that, you have the program and the pieces of the building that have to exist at a very again, at a very fundamental level. And the spaces like the laundry room or the TV room, they may not seem very glamorous, but what you do with them and where you put them makes is an architectural decision. It's very fundamental. The second part of that is then you were talking about the articulation of buildings. This is the image that's on right now of Star Apartments is a good picture of that. One of the things that we're dealing with in these projects, of course, is budget. And the decisions that you make as an architect about where you're going to prioritize putting that budget is not so much it's not a spreadsheet exercise. It's a decision about where you're going to employ the maximum effort around the creativity in the project. And that's something that we talk about in the very early phases, where we're going to, what are the important issues with this particular project? What's really at stake? What parts of the project can we focus on to get the maximum effect for the residents, for the city? And then try to be very inventive about the ways within that structure that we're using those or employing those pieces, those components of the project.
Yeah, I was very struck by that in terms of the Star. A lot of the images that we're looking at are from the Star Apartments, which many of you have likely seen yourselves. And if you haven't, you should go take a look at it. Where there's a decision about this kind of, I think you call it like a moment frame tray. There's a tray that lifts the housing up over the city. And that in and of itself is a kind of riff on an LA specific type of construction. I personally, when I moved here, was shocked by, I'd never seen it before, which is this idea that you have steel and concrete at the bottom of the building and then you build with sticks on top. That is the most, from what I understand, correct me if I'm wrong, Michael, but that is the most efficient method of building housing at the moment in Los Angeles.
The typical way of building low rise, and by low rise I mean under 75 feet tall. The typical way of building low rise housing in Los Angeles is it's called 5/1 construction, and you see it everywhere in the city. It's 5 floors, generally of wood, stick-built construction on a concrete tray or platform. And underneath the concrete tray is very often the parking. It is partially inexpensive because it's ubiquitous. It's used in all buildings, in all housing around the city. But it's also very inexpensive because it's closely aligned with the way that tract housing post-war was built in the suburbs, stick built on a slab frame. There's almost no way of doing anything that's more efficient and less expensive than that at the moment. Eventually there might be, people are looking at 3D printing projects, people are looking at robotic construction. Prefab is a little bit of a piece of that, but the economies of, the historical economies of that kind of construction are impossible to beat. So the question then is how you embrace that and try to make buildings that are pushing the ball forward, pushing ideas forward within that tradition of construction. I've come to love that construction. I've come to really embrace it because it's this never-ending puzzle of how you can get around that, how you can work with it and find a way around it and find a more inventive way of making a building within the same system that everybody else is using. How can you say something that's more articulate, more compelling, more direct, using that same system of construction? And that's it's not just a personal goal, although it is. I think it's the only way of being able to expand the vocabulary of what architecture brings to these projects. Because if you don't embrace those, if you don't embrace the givens of how things are built, you can keep trying to invent a completely different path, but it's very challenging because the construction industry is not set up to embrace that at this point. So we've taken it on ourselves in these projects to say, no matter what, right now we're going to try to work with these very typical construction methods and find ways to expand that vocabulary.
Yeah, I want to underscore that for everyone that is listening, for all of the students who are going to be engaging these kinds of problems, both in thesis and even more importantly beyond. The decision that's being made here about where the innovation and agency of architecture are going to be located in relation to these projects. The decision that the 5/1 system is going to be used as a useful constraint against which certain configurations and appearances will be innovated such that at the end of the day, you end up with a project like the Star Apartments. I think is a very good example of this. And then maybe we can switch over to lessons learned and how they might pertain to market rate housing like Santa Fe, but where all of a sudden you've got a project that is heroically expressing something that did not seem to be possible within the status quo, even though it's employing all the, as you call them, historical efficiencies that are embedded into that system. So basically, if you look at the outside of the Star Apartments, you feel like you're looking at, you know that you're looking at something designed. You know that there's an architectural presence there, even the way that tray is treated. It's almost like it's kind of raised up in a gesture that says, like you would hold precious things in your hands. These people matter, and this work matters. And it sits in the city almost as a challenge to all of the other buildings around it that might be built using those same historical efficiencies, but yet have not been able to engage one of the most pressing issues of our time. So the challenge for all of you is going to be to say to yourselves, where can I use the system but use it so differently that even operating within the status quo as it exists in my time, I am able to resist the assumptions about the invisibility or the unworthiness of particular problems or populations. And I've heard said, Michael, I've heard people say, well, that's all well and good, but you'd have to really scale this up for it to be meaningful. I think I remember you saying in an interview that while that is true, and there are ways to scale it up, it might be also worthwhile to consider the aesthetic work and the work of appearance that architects are always engaged in. So what happens when you make something that wasn't visible, even if you're building it at a scale such that you would need 500 of these Star Apartments populated all around Skid Row to do the work of permanently and supportively housing that particular population. Still, even just having one that's built and that's standing in the world, there's already a work of representation that's being done.
I think that's a really, that gets at a very important question for the role of architecture in this problem, in this cultural and social problem. If you look at the analysis or the different analyses that have been done around housing and housing deficiency in the Los Angeles area, certainly this portion of Southern California, the numbers of apartments or housing units that need to be built to achieve real housing parity, housing equity, are staggering numbers. McKinsey, Rand, all of these think tanks have looked at studies of the housing challenge, and the numbers are easily over, in many cases, 500,000 housing units that we are deficient, and most people feel those number counts are actually quite low. That means that the scale of the need for housing is beyond the scale of the individual architectural form. They're beyond a single building being able to necessarily make an immediate dent in those numbers. And that 400 or 500 or 600,000 number runs the full gamut from individuals who are homeless all the way up to through workforce housing, affordable housing, market rate housing, and beyond. So it really spans the full spectrum of housing. Nonetheless, it's a huge deficit. If you add up all of the housing that I've been involved in, it's a tiny fraction in terms of units. I'd like to believe that I'm making a contribution in trying to turn the tide around the lack of housing, but the numbers don't necessarily bear it out. And then I think it becomes a question of what role does the architect have? I mean, certainly if you're an architect and working for an enormous developer and you're building buildings that are 4,000 to 5,000 units of housing, if that's even possible, you probably, from a metric standpoint, a numbers standpoint, are making a bigger dent. But I've looked at our role as both demonstrating other ways of attacking the housing problem through different ways of building housing in the city, different construction methods, different ways of organizing the buildings, not only for the goal of making community, but even around the challenge of density, trying to create higher levels of density than are normally seen in buildings in Los Angeles, a traditionally more suburban or lower density city. Creating models that are possible to be replicated, I think is an important role for the architect. The second part of that is, as you, I think, were alluding to, the visibility of these buildings, creating a presence, especially for more anonymous, disadvantaged communities and residents, to be more visible in the city. You mentioned a quote in the beginning in your introduction, I think around, or you were talking about the need, or the fact that there's been criticism, especially of these buildings, of making things which are too nice. And I've heard that for years when we've completed projects. People have said to me in public meetings, why are you working so hard for the homeless community? Why are you trying to build something so nice? Why are you putting that much effort into it? And it's really for two reasons. One, because I think it's absolutely essential for architecture to help make invisible communities more visible. That's important to the culture as a whole. But secondly, because I can't imagine why anybody would want a building to not make a contribution to the city in general. It's the city that we all live in. And to say that you can make buildings which are not so nice, or or whatever, uglier buildings, less contributing buildings, and that is okay for the city, I think says something about our belief in our collective city, that somehow we can let certain projects, we won't hold projects to a reasonably high standard, to continue to try to help make a better, more livable, more beautiful city. So they're extremely important roles for architecture, but I think we have to be clear about what those are and not overly romantic about the we have to be very clear-eyed about where we can have an effect and what those effects are.
Mhm. Yeah, you've dedicated a significant amount of your output in this city particularly, but also in other cities, toward rethinking the scale and the type of architectural engagement, specifically as it relates to urban form. So I hope everyone here is aware of the project currently under construction, the 6th Street Viaduct project that Michael has designed and is looks like it's almost done.
Next summer. For the bridge, the landscape, all the parks, all of the space under the bridge, which on the Arts District side is a large multi-purpose arts and cultural event plaza. And then on the east side is an 11-acre park of wide range of activities. Those will start, the park and the plaza will start right around the time the bridge gets finished. But the bridge itself, you'll be able to walk or drive or bicycle across it summer of next year.
So we shall have to plan a field trip, a SCI-Arc field trip. It's very close by, very convenient for us. But even the role of a project like One Santa Fe already begins to suggest that architecture is engaged in the work of bridging at the same time that it's engaged in the work of modeling a kind of an urban microcosm. I've heard you speak about these things, and I'm curious because those are not things that would normally automatically go together. So either one would see one's work as something like an island, a project that's an island, or even an archipelago of projects that are islands, maybe with that kind of inward courtyard focus that a number of your projects have, where the idea is to create a model of community or a model of the city as a whole. Or one would think about, I don't know, the way the kind of cliches that we all say about the city stitching together the urban fabric or repairing it or bridging diverse communities or what have you. But I'm struck by the degree to which you are committed to doing both.
Certainly a project, just because of scale, a project like One Santa Fe and the 6th Street Bridge are somewhat related, also because you can see one from the other. In the case of One Santa Fe, which was an earlier project than the bridge, I was interested in a scale of the scale of the project because in a way it did have a foot in both of those camps. It is depending on how you approach One Santa Fe, the way you look at it, where you look at it from, I think you can see it as a building in the way that we often define a singular standalone building, or it is more urban fabric. And intentionally, as we were working on that project, a lot of the conversation was around whether a project could be both of those things. And in a city like LA, which arguably doesn't really have a more, doesn't have a lot of examples of a urban fabric that's related to density. There are, of course, urban fabrics here, but one related to density and scale. A building at this scale was going to, I think it meant that we had to think about it we had to think about it in a very different way than how you would approach either an urban design project or a singular architectural project. The way I thought about One Santa Fe, I became interested in this, in an idea of that I was calling anticipatory scale. What I mean by that is that if you looked at, and some of these pictures from the air, which were taken right after it was built, show that. If you look at the area around SCI-Arc and One Santa Fe, right when One Santa Fe was being built, there were individual buildings, but there were a lot of empty lots. There's a lot of openness. The river is right next to it. It was not an area that you would point to and say that's a dense part of the city. And the scale was all very modest. The buildings were all more singular buildings, smaller buildings. Certainly, SCI-Arc was the outlier, and was definitely the significant building in the neighborhood. But I thought architecture takes a long time, and architecture lasts for a long time generally, and that means that I think architecture has a responsibility to not only meet the city where it is now, but more importantly, that architecture has the responsibility to try to anticipate what the city is going to be in 15 or 20 years, because certainly architecture has that kind of lifespan. And when we did One Santa Fe, I heard a lot of criticism, again, that the building was out of scale, it was too big, it was too large for the context. And if you believe that the city is going to stay the same as it is at that given moment, then that criticism is probably true. But if you believe, as I did and I still do, that the city is going to continue to evolve and it was going to become denser and denser and larger in scale, then it was more important to try to find ways to take on that scale and to demonstrate other ways in a positive, a more progressive way of dealing with that, to, in a sense, lead the way toward other visions of what that kind of scale and density could look like. If you were to take a photograph now, that same photograph from the air of SCI-Arc and One Santa Fe, and look at how much the entire part of the city is filled in, it would be a very different photograph. In fact, the entire neighborhood is completely scaled up, even faster than I imagined. So I do think that's a role of the architect to try to find ways to forecast or anticipate how the city is evolving, how the city is emerging, and then to propose models that start to take that on. Of course, they're not the only, they may not be the only correct model, but I think it's imperative that at least architects try to demonstrate what that future might in fact look like, to take on the very genuine real problems. That's a slightly different, that was a slightly different set of questions than the bridge. And really the bridge, many of the issues for me around the bridge were how to create a new, what was infrastructure today for the city, for a city like Los Angeles. That is a city that has been largely defined by its identity, has to a large extent been defined by infrastructure, mostly the highways, the sprawl of the suburbs and the long sinuous lines of the highways. But what does it mean to be trying to do infrastructure, not immediately post-war, but what does it mean to be trying to do infrastructure for where our culture, society is today?
I think embedded in all of the comments that you just made and all of the ways that you so accurately defined the role of the architect is not just this kind of future looking engagement with what the city will be, but let's say a wager toward a city that is the one we want rather than the one we have. So the city not as a kind of neutral entity that has its own logics and continues to evolve in however it chooses, but something in which the architect has a stake along with many other stakeholders, defining that future, making it visible, and even, as you said, anticipating it in built form. I want to, this is, it's really, I feel like the way that you're talking about architecture here is really, really generous. And I hope that all of you students that are listening are picking up on all the strategies that are being presented and all of the stakes and claims that are being not just laid out, but also being demonstrated in built form. I want to make sure, Michael, that we give these students a chance to also ask questions and enter this conversation, if that's all right with you.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
And also, not least, my colleagues as well.
I think my first question would be kind of tying it back to when you guys were discussing how our city needed about 600 copies of the Star Apartments. And I'm wondering your opinion on the copy when dealing with such, I wouldn't say I guess a socially strained issue, meaning at what point is it iconographic from a copy, and what's like your perception, or just how would you deal with that? And I guess it's kind of the same for One Santa Fe. When you're dealing with such a large scale project, the idea of the copy comes in place, and what do you do to mitigate that, if that makes sense?
Maybe Caitlin, are you, is your question about should an architect be concerned about creating a more unique form and then somebody copying that?
I don't think it's about not other people copying, but within like, for example, the Star Apartments, if maybe I can root it in that, if we were to put 600 of the exact same building across the city, do you think that would in turn be problematic?
It's a good question. I think it depends on how you look at a project like Star, and how you define it. I mean, Star has a very clear architectural ambition, or had a very clear architectural ambition, a very clear massing sculptural ambition. It was meant to have a type of presence and an appearance, and in a way a boldness that forcefully put on the table ideas of building over an existing building, adaptively reusing an existing building in a city that generally scrapes sites clean and builds completely new. It was trying to really present the case for multifamily prefabrication in a city that up until then wasn't allowing it from a code standpoint. And it was trying to also produce a new form of density, and a configuration that is 180 degrees away from the suburban single-family house model of housing that we generally identify Los Angeles with. But it also, so while it was, intentionally trying to be a very strong, very present aesthetic form, and use that to communicate those ideas. It's also, I think, a project that boiled down to those fundamental ideas could be replicated, but wouldn't have to look exactly the same, and couldn't, by its very nature, deal with every new site or every new place it was located in exactly the same way. It would have to, I think it should evolve, it should change. And I think there is a question there about scale. And at what point do you tip over to something that moves beyond a catalytic scale to something which does real harm to the city? When I talked a little bit ago about how my architectural training and why housing was so important and how housing had played into that. But there's a longer and more complex history to housing, especially in the US, that isn't all a terrific story. There was a lot of pre and post-war housing projects that were built in cities that I'm sure everybody here, if you're studying housing, knows about, that had really terrible social problems associated with them, and many of them were torn down. There are a lot of reasons for that. They were disconnected from the city as a whole. Communities were more isolated. They were really isolating for the socioeconomic communities that were living there. In a way, they were, knowing what we know about housing, they were destined to fail. They were big, and they took on the problem in really ambitious and people thought progressive ways at the time. But they were very one-dimensional projects in the way that they were conceived and often constructed. And I think that's one of the things that we know more about now as architects, as urban planners, hopefully as you would hope that city planning and city leadership would know this as well, that that the complexity of the city is important, and the scale and the way that it meets that complexity is important to consider. I could imagine Star Apartments, for instance, being at the scale of one Santa Fe. But I think there's a question mark beyond that, or much beyond that, whether it becomes, is there a scale that is so large that its relentlessness starts to not only diminish its impact, but have a negative impact? And I don't think that I don't think there's a set of rules that you can apply automatically to that. I think you have to bring a real debate, a real level of criticism, and testing of that to see where those thresholds are.
I agree. Thank you.
I had a quick question about the elements that you were talking about had to be taken away from what you conceived as the architecture of the apartments once all these like budgetary constraints came in. And I think there's some very valuable lessons, especially about being able to give agency to the people that live here to create their own environment through an incidental way of having to take the architecture away. But a concern that, like, for example, we have in Thesis is still how do you bring in your affinities into the project, and through the feedback that you've had through the years with these projects and your own affinities, what would be the one architectural element that you said that you would say got taken away that you would still want to keep wanting to bring back, or would be the one thing that you would
that I go to sleep at night and think about. And I definitely have that list. It's on repeat almost every night, it seems like. I would say it was really that we lost a lot of, I mean, in totally pragmatic terms, we lost a lot of glass in the project, which meant we lost transparency. And I regret that, because while I felt like we were able, especially in that first project, Rainbow, to hang on to what we had created in terms of the internal relationships between the community within the building, I feel like we lost the ability to make stronger relationships between the community inside the building and the community outside the building, the city as a whole. Of course, these buildings, all buildings, if an apartment building, it needs to be safe, it needs to be secure, and so it can't be just open to the city. But it shouldn't be a fortress, and it still needs to live in a connected life with the city as a whole. When we did the second project, which I don't think are in the images, with the Skid Row Housing Trust, Carver Apartments, it's a project over by the 10 freeway at the end of Hope Street, right by, just adjacent to the whole LA Live development. It's a round building, and it was very conscious on the part of the Housing Trust to one, get a site that was off of Skid Row, to try to meet the homeless community in all of the places that it exists, which now really is everywhere in the city, but to not just balkanize or siloize or isolate the homeless community to one district in the city. By placing it adjacent to the 10 freeway, there was the opportunity to really make it visible, which goes back to some of what we were talking about before. The round shape actually came from a little bit the site shape, but really came from acoustic concerns, because the highway is such a loud noise source. The round shape helped to reduce the impact inside the building of the noise, but it also created this unusual and very visible shape as people were driving by. And I wanted to try to go beyond that, and we placed the laundry room and the TV room, the two places that people hang out in, at the same level as the elevated 10 freeway, so on the third floor. They're basically looking at each other. It's a small thing. There we were able to preserve more of the transparency of the glass, so that the entire facade of the laundry room, the entire facade of the TV room can be open. And the goal there was that that as you were stopped in traffic on the 10, you could see the people in the building, and people in the building could see you. And I don't have any pretensions that it's truly a front porch or acts in the same way that a front porch does on a smaller street. But in a way, it was just another attempt to elevate the possibility of communities in isolation to see each other. And I don't think that's just a question, frankly, of or just a challenge for the homeless community. I think that's a challenge for all of us, especially as isolated as we are because of the lives that we lead online. Of course, over the last 2 years, that's become even more extreme. But it's very deeply rooted in culture as a whole. And so I think that's something that I wish we hadn't lost. It's something that I continue to try to find ways to even expand in our projects today. And I believe it's something that's important, not just in these particular types of projects, but I think it's a real issue and question for the way architecture connects to cultural and social challenges in all project types and all socioeconomic levels.
Hey, Michael. Marrikka brought up a good point about your role as a stakeholder. Like, you want to produce architectural interest and you want the space to be livable as well. From the standpoint of a developer, like, these are projects to infuse their personal wealth. And I was just curious, like, the legend says that one Santa Fe, there was a massing that it was a single loaded corridor and that it looked really cool. I was curious if you could speak about the experience about working with the developer, and maybe, like, if it had gone differently, how could you have been persistent about keeping the aesthetic interests?
Right.
Yeah.
Cole, it's a very good question, because that's always that's an ongoing conversation that you have as an architect, I think, with generally all of your clients. Frankly, not just the for-profit clients like we had at One Santa Fe, but the nonprofit clients as well, because all clients have they have ambitions and they have goals, and those ambitions and goals are things that they bring to the project and are very real. And I think there are different ways of trying to take that on. You can try to convince the clients through, your sheer magnetic, persuasive personality. Maybe that works. But I've found that at best that holds off the real issue just for a little bit of time. I've found that it's much more fruitful to try to understand right at the beginning of the project what those goals and ambitions really are, and to probe those very deeply, to ask very direct questions of the client, and to understand what their ambitions, what their fears are, what their thresholds are, and to try to get a sense of that. Then I think as an architect, you have the ability to find a range of ways of implementing those ambitions, but doing it in a way that I believe makes a building that that makes real contributions, of course, to whoever is going to be living there or working there, but makes a real contribution to the city as well around it. And if there's a point where you feel like you've crossed a threshold, or you're being forced beyond a threshold that you don't believe in, then I think that's a different question. That's a question for each architect, where that threshold, where that line is, and whether you need to respectfully bow out, or is there a way to continue on? I work very hard before we even get started in a project to understand that from the client, so that if we need to bow out, we do that before we start the design. If we take on a project, I'm committed to try to find a way to both achieve those goals that the client has, but to make something which is, I believe, a strong piece of architecture. In the case of One Santa Fe, you were talking about the single loaded corridors. We masked the building a number of different ways. One Santa Fe went through many different changes. At one point, it was a portion of it in the trapezoidal, the triangular part of the site, the wider part of the site. So to the south, really directly across from SCI-Arc. There was one portion which was much taller. It was about a 12-story building. For a lot of reasons, especially around the type of construction that it seemed like we were going to need to employ. Again, that stick-built construction. The building became a more traditional, very horizontal, more or less 5/1 construction. But that put a lot of pressure on hitting the number of apartments that were not only going to make the business model work for the developer from a market rate standpoint, but we were looking to provide 20% of the units as affordable units, which meant that that business model needed to cover the offset on the 20% affordable units. And I personally had a goal to try to hit that number, that minimum number, and even see if we could go beyond that, because housing was already starting to become a real issue. And I felt that the balance of providing some single loaded corridors, providing a number of double loaded corridors, but rethinking the way that those corridors worked. In many cases, they're open air at the end, so that they're not artificially climate controlled, but they're naturally ventilated. That those were reasonable trade-offs to try to produce as many apartments in that part of the city as possible. I think you have to have a client that's willing to have you as an active partner in those debates, and create a balance that you can stand behind.
I think those were really excellent questions, guys. Thank you for participating. We are at 4 p.m. And I want to be respectful of everyone's time. But before we depart for the day, I know that you all will join me in extending our thanks to Michael for coming and talking to us, and for being for being so, I've said the word like 7 times now, for being so authentic and present with us about the role of architecture in the city today and in the world that we are shaping together. So thank you. And thank you, Maxi, for setting this up. And I hope
Michael.
we'll have you back at some point again to talk to us.
Absolutely, Marrikka, thank you. And I appreciate all the questions from the students. Good luck. Good luck with your work. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming, Michael.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Marrikka. Thank you, Maxi.
Bye, guys.
Bye. Have a great
Bye,
day.
everyone.
Bye, thanks.